Now
Yes.
that doesn't occur. Now there are areas that don't move, and then there are areas that are going to be under a lot more tension because the force is still traveling in the same way.
So welcome everyone to another episode in our season 2 of Finding Your Range podcast. I'm your host, Jeannie, a movement therapist who specializes in hypermobility, EDS and chronic pain. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest today. Now you may recognize our guest. If you watched season 1 of Finding Your Range, you will recognize our lovely guest, Anna, who joined us to talk to us all about breath, which was amazing. So if you haven't seen that one, head over to earlier episodes on YouTube and check out Anna's lovely description of breath. And it's got a beautiful breathing practice at the end of it. So really lovely and relaxing to end your day. But today, Anna's joining us to talk about something totally different. So a lady of many talents. We're going to delve deep and pick her brains again. But before we get started, I'm just going to read Anna's bio. So some of you may not know Anna, and we'll just learn a little bit about her background. So Anna Barretxeguren is a movement educator, myofascial release practitioner, and the creator of Moving Fascia. Moving Fascia is a movement method based on self-release and fascial movement techniques that has helped hundreds restore ease, minimize pain, and improve dynamic stability, fluid movement, and breath. Anna has 2 decades of experience as a movement educator, a myofascial release practitioner, and a visceral manipulation practitioner. She holds a private practice online and in person from her studio in Brighton in the UK. Anna is the founder of Evolve Movement Education, which is a training organization running anatomy and fascia courses for professionals in the field of movement and manual therapy. She holds a postgraduate diploma in anatomical sciences. She has been a movement educator in various teacher trainings for the past 15 years, and she lectures internationally on anatomy and movement. Wow, that's amazing. So thank you, Anna, for joining us again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me back, Jeannie. Such a pleasure to be here.
No, it's our pleasure, because as I say, you have so much knowledge about all things anatomy and fascia and movement. So I'm delighted that you've come back to join us. So as I say, we're going to talk to Anna about something totally different today, and we're discussing the topic of scar tissue. Now, before Anna, we start sort of chatting to Anna, I just want to say that this obviously isn't medical advice. So if you have any concerns about scar tissues or adhesions, then please obviously get that checked out by a medical professional. And we're really today discussing scar tissue, how it can affect our health and movement potential, and the qualities of scar tissue, but it's not specifically about EDS scarring. And we know obviously in classical EDS, that's a major thing in the scarring. So if you'd like more information about scarring in terms of EDS and classical EDS, I highly recommend you head over to YouTube. Nigel Burrows is obviously a skin doctor, and he speaks for the EDS Society. And on the EDS Society YouTube channel, you can listen to his presentation all about EDS, very specific scarring. So I just wanted to make that clear that this is more of a sort of a higher level, but very, very useful and interesting information. But just wanted to make that clear before we dive in. So let's get started. So Anna, what's your, obviously we heard from your bio that you have, you know, a wealth of experience in this area, and, you know, visceral manipulation and myofascial release. But what's your personal interest or journey? Why are you interested in scar tissue?
Well, obviously through my practice as a myofascial release practitioner and visceral manipulation practitioner, I have seen scar tissue a lot, and yeah, like you say, I have seen it in that context. So I've worked with people in the bodies with their scars, but personally, I have a lot of scar tissue. So I've got a scar that runs all the way from my xiphoid process, so from the base of my sternum all the way down my abdomen to almost my pubic bone. And that's from an operation I had when I was 18. So I've basically, that scar has been really part of my life for all my 20s, my 30s, and my 40s. So I really have experienced scar tissue in a really personal level, and how it can affect so many layers of me, really, not just the actual restrictions that it might bring physically into my movement, into my breath, but also, you know, in a psychological level, what it means to have a scar, and all those layers. So personally, I have that experience of scarring. I actually have experienced that scar twice, because I have the same operation again in my 30s. So yeah, so there's kind of, and maybe later on I can sort of bring in a little bit more of that story, because I imagine we're going to be ending up talking about things like adhesions, which are those extra scarring that we do into the body, because the scar obviously has a three-dimensional quality to it, and how it sort of dives into the visceral space, and it can start creating adhesions in which the organs have got less mobility, and they end up having these collagen structures created, collagen relationships. But we can talk about that later. But personally, I have experienced adhesions, and I have experienced some complications with adhesions with led to another operation. And so personally, I have got, you know, some relationship with scar tissue.
So it's really, and I like the fact that you mentioned the psychological aspect, and you know, I didn't touch on that in you know, my planning, but I would really like to sort of come back to that maybe at the end, and just discuss the sort of psychological implications of that, because you know, a lot of people are ashamed of their scars, you know, and you know, with a condition like EDS, as I mentioned earlier, especially the classical type EDS, people can get, you know, exactly, and in obvious places, you know, on their legs, on their arms. So it'd be really interesting to hear your views on that. So thank you, Anna. So so pretty major scar right the way through the torso, really, through the abdomen, which, as you mentioned, is going to impact, I would imagine, the organs and everything, the movement potential underneath that scar. Very
absolutely.
So you touched on it briefly, but for those of us that don't know, what is scar tissue, and why is that different from our normal tissue?
Okay, so scar tissue appears obviously after there's been a wound, so it's part of the wound healing process. And I mean, the thing we do as humans is we regenerate, we heal. Is part of our innate. We've got this one health that is innate to all of us, and we heal. We are in constant state of change, and we heal. So a scar tissue is that regeneration of connective tissue that that happens as part of the healing process. Now, I think one thing that is interesting is that regeneration is there from the onset. Like, we can have regeneration in the womb, even in you know, a fetus can have regeneration as well. So when we are inside the womb, it has been found that for the first 3 months of our healing, if there is any kind of regeneration that happens in the tissue when we are developing in the womb, we don't actually form scar tissue. We just regenerate the same tissue. And it's only after around 3 months of development that, if there is any kind of wound to the connective tissue in the fetus, and obviously later on in the baby and the human, it will go through a scarring process. So the scar tissue it goes through. There are different processes of what occurs at cellular level when there's been a wound. The first thing that happens, obviously, is the coagulations. We start to coagulate, so we stop the bleeding.
Yes.
And the next stage is a stage of cell proliferation. So there's a lot of activity coming into the area, and it's been found that one of the first things that happens is that there's a proliferation of mast cells. So we've got a lot of mast cells arriving to the area. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of cytokine activity as well. And there is a proliferation of cells and inflammatory process. So we get inflammation to the area as part of the healing process, because inflammation, and I am not talking about chronic systemic inflammation, I'm talking inflammation localized to a particular area after there's been a wound, is part of the healing process. So the first thing that we have is this inflammation to the area. And the mast cells specifically start to stimulate the fibroblasts in that connective tissue. The fibroblasts, I am aware that I'm throwing out all these different names, but I know that the EDS community probably has definitely heard about mast cells. I'm going to imagine. Yes. and obviously they might have also heard about fibroblasts, which are those cells that are in charge of the layout of the collagen fibers and the other fibers, as well as the sort of environment that there is in the connective tissue. Not just the layout, but also the breakdown, so that they decide the knitting of the fibers. So that's the second sort of stage of the healing process. First, there's this inflammation, and the inflammation and the mast cells stimulate the cells of the connective tissue, which are the fibroblasts. And then there is a layout of collagen. So we start to get fiber buildup. We start to appear, fibers start to appear, and the connective tissue starts to knit together.
Yes, yeah, makes sense.
Now, it doesn't come and knit together like normal connective tissue would. And that's the difference between normal connective tissue and scar tissue. So it is found to be a lot less pliable. It has a lot less flexibility in it. And one characteristic of it as well is that the way that the collagen is laid out, it doesn't have the organized pattern that you will get in other connective tissue or in other types of fascia. And this is really important, because it means that scars, although they are less pliable, they are also weaker. It's weaker tissue than normal. Than normal laid out collagen. So that's quite sort of. I hope that's. I haven't made it too complicated, and it's. But on a kind of, what is scar tissue? Well, scar tissue is the regeneration of the connective tissue, but with a bit of a sort of different buildup of the way that the collagen gets laid.
And that's really interesting, because obviously someone with EDS or a connective tissue disorder already has, under the microscope, the collagen looks very dispersed, like like Nigel Burrows, who I mentioned earlier. He talks about having the end of a rope being sort of frayed, so the collagen looks all splayed out as opposed to tightly packed together. And I guess if you've then got scarring going on top of that, that's going to be even messier. Whereas normal tissue is going to knit together to the best of its ability. But if you've already got that condition, I guess that's why we end up with sort of bumpy, lumpy scars that maybe aren't, as smooth as maybe they could be. It's really interesting. And the fragility of it makes sense as to why people's scars often open up again, especially after surgery. Things often start to come apart again because of the fragility of tissue. So you definitely see the impact of that. I
have so when I teach, usually movement professionals and manual therapists, I use a lot of props, and I did bring one of my little props, which is very simple. I am aware that this is a podcast, and this will be put also on YouTube, so I thought I would bring it anyway.
Yes, please.
And so basically, all I have here is just a bit of parcel tape. Parcel tape has got those strands of fibers through it. And what I've done is I've laid it in different directions so that they create patterns. I don't know if you can see it very easily on there. So that would be a lot stronger that, because of the knitting being so kind of geometrical and those patterns being in this kind of real relationship that creates a tensile strength. And that's what we're talking about, that is missing in the scarring process. So we end up with collagen layout. Yes, we still produce fibers, but those fibers are not being laid and organized in an organized pattern, such as, I mean, this is obviously a simplistic view of how the three-dimensionality of our collagen would be. But it might be useful for someone to visualize, oh, okay, I see the strength of that. Whereas if it was more of a sort of mess, like the noodles in the soup or something, that's not going to have the same tensile strength. Yeah, maybe it's very strong in this direction, but actually when I pull in this direction, it opens.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. And so are there different types of scars? So we mentioned adhesions, which I guess are very simplistic. Are adhesions internal scars? And then you've got obviously the scarring on our skin layer. So
so there are different types of scars. I mean, the scars can become fibrotic, at the skin level or at the superficial level. Scars can become, so that can be one of the different types of scars, or one of the problems that can happen. So there is almost like an overproduction of collagen. There's too much collagen. That doesn't mean that the scar is stronger because of the conversation that we've just had about the way that it's knitted. But there is almost too much proliferation and too much. There is a conversation about whether this is due to the mast cell over activity and whether that over inflammatory response has got an effect on the fibrotic, how we end up with too much collagen. So we can end up with hypertrophic scars or keloids. In which the scarring at the superficial level looks a lot more raised usually. Sometimes it looks swollen and red. The redness, another of the processes that we didn't go into detail about, but that happen in that first stage of proliferation, is that we have a process of angiogenesis where obviously a lot of the blood vessels in the wound process have been damaged. So there has to be, angiogenesis is the creation of new blood vessels. So we have got that extra sort of creation of blood vessels. And so there can be a lot of redness in the scars. Keloids are a problematic sort of scar. But we can say that that's a type of scarring as well. And then obviously what we see on the surface is only the tip of the iceberg, because this buildup of collagen doesn't just happen in the area of where the scar is visible to the eye, but it becomes a three-dimensional three-dimensional. It grows into the body, so it goes inwards, and it ends up potentially in the visceral space. Obviously it depends where that scar is, but a scar in the abdomen or in the thorax or in the pelvis is going to have much more potential of affecting the organs inside the trunk. So yeah, so adhesions
Fascinating.
are that extra buildup of collagen around areas where, I mean, this we can go into talking about adhesions if you want, how yeah, I mean, maybe we're talking about that later, so I'll just leave it for now because I
no, I think we can, you know, it's interesting because people with EDS are often told that we should avoid surgeries if at all possible because, well, poor wound healing, again, because of the knitting together and then the opening up of the wounds, but also we're quite prone to these adhesions. So yeah, I think, you know, we can talk a little bit about those because, you know, I've seen so many people who are suffering and struggling with movement and pain because of adhesions from surgeries. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah, so the adhesions can be really problematic. The adhesions are, like we're saying, where what we're seeing with the eye is only the tip of the iceberg, and I think for me that is probably one of the most important metaphors to think of with a scar. If you think of the skin, and the scar that you're seeing is only just that tip, and then if you do visualize the inside of the body and how that can kind of grow into this knitting of extra fibers, so this fibrotic kind of growth that can start to affect the organs. So the organs themselves, and this I think is important to understand because not everyone has this visual of the viscera. The way that the viscera sit inside us is that they are suspended and they have got these ligaments. So they have got these, almost, if we can imagine them, spider web relationships to the structure. And some of these spiderweb relationships to the structure have a lot to do with their stability. So they kind of they're not necessarily hanging as such, but you can imagine that they have tensile relationships in various pooled connections. Some of those, they're not only just about their suspension mechanism, but also about their ability to have an interoception or an interoceptive quality. So our nervous system being able to understand what the motility or the movement and the mobility of that organ is, will happen also through the movement that occurs in these collagenous structures that suspend the viscera, but also you could imagine them as a sort of undersea kind of seaweed environment. And the movement of that seaweed is necessary to anchor the viscera, to anchor the organs, but also to give them that pliability and that mobility that they need to move, and that pliability and that mobility that they need to send messages of I am okay back to the central nervous system. I mean, this is quite a poetic way of describing it.
Oh, it's beautiful. I was just thinking, gosh, I just love how you describe things. I could totally see that in my head. I hope our listeners really got onto that journey. You describe it so beautifully, you always do, but yeah, totally understand that. And of course, people are thinking, as you say, people probably think, didn't even know my organs were supposed to move, they're just, aren't they sort of fixed in a place?
I think a lot of people also think of their organs as oranges inside a shopping bag. Like you get a shopping bag and you just put all the oranges inside it, and the oranges are the organs, and there is the structure of the shopping bag, and they're just sitting one on top of the other, and that would not be a very healthy environment. I mean, how were we able to have that constant communication and fluidity that is needed through the lymphatics and the vessels that need to, and the nervous relationships and the physiology that needs to happen. So it's that sort of undersea environment, if we can imagine the inside of the body in these kind of poetic seaweed relationships that are anchored. So that is necessary. And then when the scarring happens and the adhesions begin to happen, each organ, which is there within its own capsule, and the organs are usually in what we call visceral fascia, and there will be a sort of capsule of organ, but this fluidity starts to be compromised because now that capsule is over, let's call it tight. So there's not too much buildup of collagen, so now there isn't the movement that needs to happen. So that will be one type of adhesions. That will be the most clear and easy to understand way of like, okay, so I've got scarring in my abdomen, and that creates a buildup within the visceral world that does not need to be there, and it compromises the mobility of those organs. That's one of the things that it compromises. Of course, as it compromises the mobility, is also going to compromise the physiology. So the physiological needs that are out of the liver is going to be, now it doesn't move the same, is going to be compromised. It's going to compromise breath if that's within the trunk, especially because of the diaphragm now having these restrictions that the diaphragm can't move quite as much. Absolutely. And it's also going to be sending signals into the central nervous system that can be registered as pain. So it can start to really create that vicious cycle of pain response.
That makes perfect sense. Okay.
We also have to think, Jeannie, that when one of the things that when we've got wounds, especially in the trunk, we end up with scarring also deep in the layers beneath, because obviously the surgeon's gone into depending on what the surgery was, is usually gone in through into the peritoneal sac, and then through into finding the I don't know whether it was in the intestine or wherever they're going. And obviously those operations are going to end up with much more likelihood of developing adhesions. That's not to say that a superficial scar cannot end up producing adhesions.
Okay, so even a superficial one could cause adhesions, but obviously, of course, if you have abdominal surgery, even something like a C, lots of people, me included, will have had a C-section. That's obviously cuts right through the abdomen. So scar tissue, I still feel, it still doesn't feel right where my scar is. So the nerve endings and everything have been totally, destroyed, I guess, there.
Which is another thing that we need to touch on in terms of it doesn't just compromise the mobility, but it also compromises the nervous network.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes, because as the tissue is less fluid and less mobile, the adjacent fluid is going to usually become less fluid and less mobile too. So, even if the scar tissue, and this is maybe something we can, this is a big subject, and I could be talking here for another 3 hours. But in terms of how we work with it, that's something else to kind of think of. Not just the scarring, but also the adjacent tissue, the surrounding tissue that loses this pliability. And the nervous system is going to be very, very important in how it gets really affected. And a C-section, especially, they're going through an organ as well. They're going through the womb as well. So they're not just going through the. But even if I can just also say, because I feel that we're focusing a lot in the viscera within the trunk, and that I, when I teach movement. So I teach anatomy to movement therapists, so movement teachers, and I teach anatomy to fascial anatomy to manual therapists, and we go through a whole journey. But one of the things that I always talk about is the visceral arm and the visceral leg, because we tend to think of the viscera being only in the trunk, and of course the main organs are there. but we have to think that there is a lot of visceral tissue. For me, my circulatory system, for example, is all visceral. It's not just the heart is the viscera, and then the vessels are the vessels. So, like the vessels are also have that connective, the connective tissue in the vessels is also got the visceral quality. And if we have got scarring in the limbs, we're going to usually also compromise those sheaths that envelope our vessels and our nervous pathways and lymphatics. And so, yeah, that's also another element to think about.
Yeah, goodness. So when people, hip operations, knee operations, all of that. Yeah, that's amazing. Didn't really, didn't think
hip
of that
operations.
Before. Yeah, like a hip replacement, for example.
Yes.
Or I've had a hip arthroscopy, you know, pretty major operation.
And the hip is so close to the pelvis. The pelvis is so close to the viscera of the true pelvis. So yes, it's definitely going to have implications.
Yeah, and so that brings me on to how that sort of operation or any operation or scar tissue can affect our movement and health. Because after my hip arthroscopy, again, this was many years ago, so we're talking 2011, I think, many years ago now. But, and before I really delved deep into knowing all of this stuff, so I was pretty naive, but I knew that once I started moving again, I knew that I had some stiffness and tightness. And so being presented with stiffness and tightness, I thought, I'll just get on my reformer and I'll stretch it out and I'll do lots of lunges and I'll open it. And I could feel it stretching. And I thought, actually, that feels quite good. That the next day I couldn't walk. Okay, so I learned my lesson through experimenting that I can't really stretch my scar tissue, because I presume there's a lot of scar tissue in there. So what should we do? You know, how is it going to affect our movement? Should we be stretching our scar tissue? I presume we're going to say no. So what are your thoughts on that?
So, I remember your hip operation, Jeannie. There's so much to talk about here. I don't know where to begin, because of course, you know, how can a scarring affect our movement if we start from that? And then even that is a massive subject. But if we just go with if we can go from the adhesions, how can it, because obviously we can talk about how it can affect a superficial scar can affect the movement, but also how the adhesions can affect the movement. So obviously now that we've got this change to this kind of fluid environment of the viscera, now these organs are encapsulated in these, I'm going to call them cages. They're not going to be cages. They're going to be more like cocoons. Yeah. So like connective tissue cocoons that now they can't really move in the way that they could move before.
Yeah.
So if you now start to create big movement into this sea and the sea world, you can imagine that where before there was a sense of the fluidity traveling across like a wave and evenly distributing this motion throughout all the structures that it was finding, the force was traveling through and was finding all these different structures, and it was kind of like all of it was going to be homogeneously distributed. Now that doesn't occur. Now there are areas that don't move, and then there are areas that are going to be under a lot more tension because the force is still traveling in the same way. So very important. So that's very important to have in mind, especially directly after the surgery. So like to allow ourselves for a long period of healing. And the inner space is going to take a lot longer to heal than what we see on the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, this is one of those snakes that bites its tail, because because likewise, say that we do the opposite and we decide to just directly after surgery create no movement at all and be scared of moving. The less we move, the more that we're going to invite for that collagen to be building and to create these, I'm going to call them cocoons again. Yeah, these cocoons around the,
thicker,
you know, they're
maybe,
not just, these kind of
cocoons.
fibrous relationships being much more fibrous. So we need certain level of movement. Now we need to be, this is where movement specialists like yourself or me or many others that we know are going to be key in helping us find more ease in our breath. And so that we can create as much as we can that fluid environment inside, and then more ease in the surrounding tissues to the scar. If we think about it at the level of the surface, not so much that inner sea world, we're gonna again have those that area in which the scar is built up being not very strong anymore, is weaker tissue. We talked about that. And if we start to put that under tension, that's going to lose its integrity. Now, the surrounding tissue around the scar tends to get also compromising its fluidity. So there are different techniques that a myofascial release practitioner, a well-trained myofascial release practitioner, and maybe a visceral manipulation practitioner as well, can help you work with to try to find a little bit more fluidity in the surrounding tissue around the scarring, so that as that tissue is more fluid, less force travels to the scar itself, because now the movement is able to transfer itself around the surrounding area. So scar tissue is a difficult thing to work with because you need a certain level of fluidity. And then yet, like you say, if you go into stretching and you put in the tissue right under tension, what you're going to find is that you're going to potentially put it into a challenging, dangerous even place.
Absolutely.
So that's a long-winded sort of quick answer to
makes perfect sense. Basically, we have to be gentle, of course, especially with EDS. We're always going to take the gentle approach anyway. We certainly shouldn't be beating ourselves up and trying to force our bodies to do something. We have to respect that tissue. And like you say, work with compassion and healing around that whole area, you know. But that's really, that makes perfect sense.
An important idea for people to visualize, instead of thinking of stretching, think of mobilizing. So think of mobilizing the area as opposed to stretching, creating more mobility and encouraging fluidity, encouraging breath. And in that, you will not only find that there is, in that there is a lot of stability in the mobility and the fluidity that we find.
Absolutely. So the big question is, the big answer is do not stretch your scar tissue. And especially, with EDS, after surgeries, we are, as we know, going to have more fragility, more risk of scars opening up. We do not want to be beating ourselves up and going aggressive with this. And Anna mentioned about myofascial release, and I know obviously Anna is a myofascial release expert. So can you talk to us about, so this could be a nice way of working with our scar tissue through myofascial release. So could you explain, what does myofascial release do, and why could that be a good option for us?
So myofascial release, it's got the name of like you're releasing fascia. It's kind of a big discussion, like what is it that we are releasing? What is it that we are releasing? It's a kind of confusing name. I like to think about it as we are, inviting through our hands for that relationship of the fluidity being evenly transferred across all tissues. So usually my fascia release practitioner will have an understanding of connective tissue, and will have an understanding of the different relationships of how the myofascia, so the fascia of our musculoskeletal structure, as well as our visceral fascia and our, all the different types of fascia, superficial fascia, or our whole connective tissue network has got relationships, and understands how perhaps someone comes in with pain in the shoulder, but maybe that is not the origin of the pain, and there is a restriction elsewhere in the body. So in terms of the scarring, we tend to work around the area of the scar to create more fluidity around those tissues, like we were saying. And it can be really useful when the scar has healed. So you want to obviously wait for the scar to heal before you see a myofascial release practitioner.
Okay.
I think it's important also to do visceral manipulation.
Okay. So how is that? What is that?
So visceral manipulation is a branch of myofascial release, we could say, and is another sort of a speciality. And there are different schools that you can train with. One of them, the one I trained with, is the Barretxeguren Institute. The name again can be quite misleading, because when you say to someone, at a dinner party, what do you do? Oh, I do visceral manipulation. They'll run away. So it's not about manipulating the viscera as such. There's a lot of gentle approach in there, and there's a lot of listening. We have an understanding of viscera and the physiology, but also their mobility and the anatomy of these structures that we've been talking about within the visceral ligaments and their effect, and how the viscera should move. And through the hands, being able to listen to which areas maybe there is a little less fluidity, and be able to bring a bit more fluidity to those areas. So visceral manipulation can be very useful. There are different types of visceral manipulation. Some of it can be very aggressive. And if I can encourage your community, the EDS community, to this, I don't believe will be the best thing for someone with EDS. To if they are going to see a visceral manipulation practitioner, that they make sure that is someone that has been recommended as having a really gentle hand and having a real gentle approach to visceral manipulation.
Absolutely.
I would like to say one more thing in terms of adhesions that I think is really important, as complications that can come up with adhesions. So adhesions can create a lot of pain, but also sometimes adhesions can create hernias within the body itself, so within the visceral space. So the way that these buildup of collagen could end up creating an opening where there should not be an opening. So that now you have, a hernia in the abdomen, and a normal surface hernia. Everyone knows that is an opening in the connective tissue of the abdomen, so that the potential danger with that is that the intestine and one of the intestine loops could get caught into that opening, and that is, that's a death threat. That doesn't take too long for that to become gangrenous. So everyone knows that that's just quite dangerous. So you could end up with a hernia deep into your visceral ligaments. So, for example, or within one of the organs. And so adhesions can lead in extreme cases to intestinal occlusions. So there could be a mechanical stuck intestine loop in there. And that's dangerous, and that's an emergency operation. So I have suffered that myself in my
Have you?
30s. Yeah, so
Wow.
that's I suffered that in my 30s. So it was a complication of the adhesions that I had internally in my mesentery, had a hernia.
Yes.
And that hernia was there from when I was 18, from that original
Wow.
operation. And it was created at that time for whatever reason. One of my intestine loops ended up getting caught in that hernia, and I needed a abdominal surgery within hours. It was complete agony. It was an awful experience.
Wow.
So it is important that we work with our breath and we work with our fluidity and mobility, because this is going to affect not only the ability to move and the ability to breathe and maybe the ease and the pain, but it's also potentially going to affect our physiology. So it's also an important thing to have in mind.
Absolutely. Gosh, thank you so much for explaining all that. I feel like I've learned so much just listening to you. So the scar tissue is, we can work with it with the myofascial release, and we can do the visceral manipulation gently, of course. But scar tissue is scar tissue. It's not like it's ever going to change back into, it's there for good. You've got it. Yes. So basically we have to learn to manage it and to, as you've been talking about, improve the fluidity and the mobility, but it's not ever going to change. It doesn't go away.
Well, no, like we were saying earlier, that regeneration is something that happens. We do regeneration, but it hasn't been found. I mean, the healing process in those features that we were talking about would be the regeneration without scar tissue. We, as we do regeneration with the scar tissue. Of course, we can invite the scar tissue to have more fluidity, and as it's created by doing certain things, and we can obviously affect the surrounding tissue, but scar tissue is a scar tissue, and it will not change. We don't want it to. We want it to stay knitted. We want it to stay connected. So the idea of like aggressively have a go at our scar tissue is not necessarily a good thing. There are things that people that are coming out of surgery, straight out of surgery, can do that are very simple and very gentle, to just start to have a connection with their own scar, which is another important part of scarring. Because, like you say, a lot of the time feels like it's not something that we even recognize. It becomes almost numb or alien, strange. We don't recognize it as our abdomen anymore, or as our arm, or wherever the scar is. So that reconnection is very important from the onset. So from the moment that you come out of an operation, you can start to begin the healing process. Well, you are beginning the healing process unconsciously anyway, but consciously you can invite your breath to travel to the area and to gently start to almost meditate or have an internal experience of how it feels to be in relationship to your scar tissue.
That's really nice. Gosh, I wish I'd known that years ago when I had my C-section, 18 years ago. Because it took me a long, long time to even accept it. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to touch it. If someone had explained this to me back then, it would have changed so many things. I would have been much more compassionate, I think, towards myself. So that kind of brings us on to what we hinted at earlier about the psychology of it. Like you say, connecting with it, accepting it as part of you. And it's, it's not something we should be ashamed of, or
There's so many layers to scarring. There's so many that we haven't touched on. There's the psychology of it. I mean, of course, there is the emotional, and the trauma is hidden there. So the psychology of it is important, and is is key to the healing, and to be able to reconnect to this, say hello to this new scarring, this new tissue, and accept it. Obviously, there are many levels of it. It depends on where the scar is. You know, if you're wearing your scar in your face, you're gonna have to change, because, I mean, even socially, you know, we co-regulate, we read each other, so we might actually even. I remember with my scar when I was 18, so my scar runs all the way through my abdomen, and you know, I was wearing a bikini. It's just a thing, you know, in Spain, you just wear a bikini. It's not like, you know, and my mom was great, because she was really saying, you know, don't you think you're going to be wearing a swimming costume from now on? You're going onto the beach with a bikini. And it was the first time, was really kind of like, and of course, people do look at my scar even now, that when I walked, and now I am proud, you know, I walk down the beach in Spain, and people, some kids look at things, don't they? It's just kids stare. Of course they stare. It's amazing. It's incredible. My belly is an incredible story. I mean, I've got so many stories about my abdomen, and they see it, and they're fascinated. They're not scared of it. That's why they look at it. And but amazing. It took me a long time to feel that. It took me a long time. For a long time, it was walking down the beach and just feeling, oh my God, she's looking, he's looking, and I just wanted to hide it. And what that creates in the abdomen is a sense of contraction, of disappear. I don't want you. So it's not a sense of ownership and expansion and allowance and being. It's a sense of disconnection, which
wow, that's really powerful. Never thought of that. It's going to have so much impact, isn't it? If you're ashamed, if you're hiding,
exactly,
it goes so much deeper, doesn't it? Wow.
Gosh. So there's so many levels.
There are, and like you say, it's part of you. It tells an amazing story. It shows how amazing the body is to heal itself, and just amazing.
And it tells how strong you are. Absolutely. It tells how strong you are, that you went through that, and here you are. Here you are, and you're not bleeding out. Hello. That's quite an achievement.
Absolutely.
Even just that is quite an achievement. But of course, there are many levels, and sometimes the scarring has happened through traumatic experiences. And, you know, I'm kind of talking about it lightly here. And the experience is not the same for everyone. Some people have a lot of trauma, and obviously there is a lot of trauma processing to do. So there are so many practitioners that will be able to help with that as well. Because it is a journey. It is definitely a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank you. And just thinking, you know, you obviously are a movement educator, and I've seen you move, and you move beautifully. Given your history, you know, and also encouragement for our listeners who are starting their movement journeys, how does that feel? You know, how come you're able to do these beautiful extensions and flexions, and yet you have your scar tissue? So there's clearly hope for us that we can all move better, in a better way, despite what we might have been through.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeannie. It's always I don't know how to answer, if I'm telling you the truth. I think
I guess you've obviously worked so much on your body, on your mind, and like you say, you've gone through that. It wasn't always like that, I'm sure. You had to work to build up to being able to do the things that you can do now.
It is a constant journey.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I really open up to what you've said, and it touches me, and I am really I'm grateful for you seeing that I am moving in that way. And yet I feel there is so much to do. I am in constant state of change. You are, so we all are in constant state of change. So thinking that when we have a scar, like we said earlier, once a scar, always a scar, and we're gonna have to continue to work with it and continue to maintain the fluidity throughout the tissues and the organs and the joints and the movement is gonna have to be something that is a constant journey. And I mean, I suppose I was very young when I first had my my major operation. I have had many challenging health issues, as we talked on that previous podcast. I also suffer from this lung condition, which was a complication of that other operation I had after my adhesions. So it was a complication of the adhesions. But I think perhaps the fact that I've been on that movement journey from very early on, that has really helped me stay in that constant. I will encourage anyone, whatever age they are, that there is still potential for change right until the last breath. There's still constant change and regeneration right until the last breath. And that if you are willing to dive in from whatever layer it is, from whatever point of view it is, whether it's through the psychology of it or getting in through, how it affects you emotionally, spiritually, physically, there is always potential for growth. So to be curious and to stay curious and to find, someone to support you through that journey, to guide you, but the journey is yours. That's for sure.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Oh, I feel honestly, I've learned so much today. Is there anything else? I mean, you've just shared a lot there, but is there anything else our audience could benefit from knowing, or any other tips? Or
I did make some notes, so I'm gonna have a look. But I think we've talked so much, and I feel like there is still so much to kind of explore in terms of sparring. But I think we've covered most things of what I wanted to talk about today.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us again. It's really brilliant. And your way of explaining things is just so beautiful. You can really picture it, and it just makes it so much easier to understand. So thank you. So how can people find out more about you if they want to look you up, find out about your work?
So I suppose they can find me on Instagram and Facebook and all those channels, either looking for Evolve Movement Education or looking for Barretxeguren, if they can spell it. I think the best way to find out about me is to go on the website. So Evolve Movement Education, or to look up moving fascia, which is the method that I have. So if there are teachers and movement educators, probably that's the best way. And otherwise, well, the same. Just write an email via the website, and I'll be very happy to engage in conversation.
Exactly. So if
anyone DM me on.
If you have questions, if anything that came up today you'd like to know more about, you can either leave a comment down below on here, or as Anna said, I'm sure she would respond if you messaged her personally. So obviously reach out if you do have questions, and we will help if we can answer or point you in the right direction. So thank you once again, Anna, for your time and your expertise and your passion, as always, for sharing with us. I'm sure our listeners learnt a lot because you made it very easy to understand. So thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of Finding Your Range. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And until then, keep moving.